Senator Higgins, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for joining us, Minister, and for your contribution. Just to kind of focus in on just some of the issues that have come up, some of the questions I would have had have been addressed, so I thank you for that, and I'll just maybe try to build further on them. I wanted to touch first just on the question of pensions. While I would welcome, and Minister will know my previous lifelong advocated around the home caring credits and the increase in home caring credits in relation to the pension and in relation to that 20 year there, I do have a concern in relation to the T12, and it's a longer term concern. I am concerned about the threshold being pushed out potentially to 40 years. So I'm concerned about that 20 years of home caring credit being considered within a 40-year frame, and I would be very, very seriously concerned if we were to move towards a 40-year contribution requirement in terms of our pension system in the longer term. And I know that that is one of the measures on the table, and I recognise there have been consultations. I think perhaps that issue wasn't as clear as it could have been in the consultation over the summer. I know a lot of people found that consultation a little difficult to navigate, but that is a key concern. And we know, for example, that ICTU is one of the, and again, ICTU, not necessarily an intergroup, but ICTU representing a large volume of real people who are workers, has expressed very serious concern if the goalposts were to be moved to 40 years. So that's a concern. And again, Minister, as you talked about the idea of looking at other ideas to how we can supplement the social insurance fund in relation to the self-employed, and I would ask that a similar creativity be brought by the state in terms of finding ways to ensure that we can address care, recognise care, without necessarily pushing the threshold out. So that's a key concern I would have. And there's a smaller concern, but it's more detailed, and I'm sure your officials have indicated they're looking at it, around those who perhaps are carers but are not having contributions made on their behalf because they returned to care, and who can fall out of the contributory system in terms of pensions. Of course, pensions is one of those areas as well where there is a gender inequality dimension, and Minister, a strong concern of mine is the question of gender inequality proofing of the budget. I know that is planned to be intensified this year, and I know that the Budgetary Scrutiny Committee have also, for example, asked that departments, and I think they specifically named social protection, might consider using the expanded switch model in terms of a gender analysis of the budgetary measures. I just might ask what your plans are around the gender inequality proofing, and particularly will you be looking at that revised switch model as a way to kind of test the measures. And another, for me, I think probably the litmus test on whether there is a gender inequality perspective brought to the social protection budget this year will be around the question of lone parents. And I do want to acknowledge, Minister, I know that this is an issue which you have engaged on. I recognise that in January you spoke about unwinding the cuts. I think it was at the ESRI that you spoke about that, so that I recognise that you have a concern in this area and that some measures were taken in the last budget. But I think there's a few really specific things that we need to see happen in this budget. The question of the qualified child increase is important in terms of the teenage children. And I would just maybe just a little bit kind of push back on this question. I realise, yes, there are huge wider issues in terms of services and in terms of supports that I think you very eloquently spoke to. But those are issues which affect all children in relation to consistent poverty. But we know that those problems, while they're problems affecting everybody, we know that children in lone parent families are up to 3 times more likely to be in consistent poverty. So there are additional and specific supports that do need to be addressed into that area. And I think in terms of the qualified child increase is one area. But the other thing, what we talked about, that cost of teenagers and the cost of, there is a real problem at the moment, which is that because those who are parenting alone leave the job seeker transitional payment when their child reaches the age of 14, that at exactly that time when the additional costs and difficulties and challenges kick in, the caring obligations and the caring work that they are doing becomes invisible effectively to the system. And there is a real concern, and a simple measure, as you say, Minister, it's not simply about cost, it is around recognition. And if we were to increase the job seeker's transitional payment, where you, not the payment I'm talking about, but the eligibility for it, to allow all of those who have children up to the age of 18 to be in the job seeker transitional payment. It means that they would, for example, still be able to work full-time, but also be able to work part-time according to the needs that they might have. It means that they would still be able to access potentially income disregard. It means that the additional supports of the system would continue to be directed to them. And I think that simple change from 14 to 18 would make a very significant difference. Children's allowance was mentioned, and I recognise, as you do, that it's a universal payment. There is a concern, though, for those where children have dropped out of school, particularly vulnerabilities. There's concerns around whether parents and families can lose child benefit payments, and there's been some questions on that. And that might be, again, one of the indications of vulnerability might be a situation where a child is dropping out of school. It might be a time when families need more support rather than potentially less. That was one concern I had. There's also, in relation to the CE schemes, it was mentioned around that fall. I would suggest that potentially, in addition to Job Path and, of course, the upturn in employment, one other factor that has been raised by lone parent advocates in particular was that while there is an improvement in many ways in general across childcare, there are specific schemes like the CETS scheme or the CEC scheme which have fallen away a little bit, and there's a concern that some of the additional targeted childcare supports that were there for people taking part in CE schemes might need to be looked at again, because they are kind of falling through the cracks, as it was, and I think that's an area that needs to be looked at. There's also the question of the quality of outcome. I think, Kate, it was mentioned around quality part-time education access. There's also quality part-time employment measures that allow people to be in, not necessarily going into precarious employment or full-time and have that be the binary, but have quality part-time employment routes that are created for those who are trying to balance, for example, care and the rebuilding of a labour market attachment. In regards to that, there's a lot of overlap, and we've talked a lot in this committee about the overlap. We talked about it for people with disability, and you will be looking, I'm sure, Minister, at our report in relation to that, but around things like the Back to Education allowance, the SUSI grant, rent allowance, how these intersect and how people can find that there's obstacles effectively to going back into an education option. In relation to the question of activation, and we've talked about employment being there, that question of shifting towards, if not an education first, which I would personally like, but at least an education equal, so that education options are really being put on the table. And there are a number of ways where they fall between the cracks. It can depend. It can be the luck of the draw as to at what point you end up on the live register, whether or not you're getting offered a college course or you're getting pushed into a 2-week training. You know, that can make the difference. And there is a real concern there, because we want to make sure that everybody is accessing the right option for them and the best option for them in that regard. In terms of we talked about other payments in other areas. One of the other key issues, given the new and the wider remit that your department has, and maybe you might address it, is how you are going to engage with other departments around the quality of employment. And again, I think that's going to be important in the budgetary context. I know you mentioned that people don't want to suggest tax areas. I will happily suggest a few areas. I think that unless we see significant changes within the hospitality sector, the fact that there are so many staff in that sector who are still in poor conditions and poor employment, we do need to question the VAT rate that is being given if movement is not made. And I would also note that in terms of pensions, we know that we are spending over $2 billion in private pension tax relief. So I think the 70 million that was mentioned, the 290 million that Senator Ardagh mentioned, is a very small drop in the ocean compared to the 2 billion that we are, over 2 billion, I think it's 2.3, and Minister, I'm sure you will have the figure yourself, and I know we've spoken about this in the Shannon Chamber, that we are spending on private pension tax relief. And I do think we need to look and say, yes, there are merits potentially to it, but does this marginal rate, which disproportionately benefits higher earners, again, it's not even a standard rate, this is a marginal rate increase, is it the best investment in terms of our people, and is it the best recognition of contribution across the board? I know that I'm short on time, so I'm just going to go to two last...
Conclude now, Senator.
I will come to conclusion at this point, but I have two other simple points to make. One is, it's a little bit outside the budgetary issue, but I think it's an important one, which is the question of there are still, Minister, concerns. I know you won't be, this is budgetarily focused, but around the public service card. And in the media recently, we saw last week that there are, again, I know we don't necessarily trust the media, but I know that we have heard concerns, and very serious concerns, in relation to the cross-departmental sharing of data. that is in the single customer view data set that makes up the public service card data set, and whether or not there is in fact a satisfactory legal basis for that, and if there is not a satisfactory legal basis, what measures might be taken. And there are concerns which I've raised previously with you in relation to issues such as the biometric data and what is to be recognised or not recognised as biometric data. I know we've had situations where contractors who were called biometric have renamed themselves, but a renaming and a moving around of the words, still we are looking at a fundamental definitions, and I think under European definition that some aspects of the single customer view data set are likely to end up being in that area of biometric data. There will need to be different and appropriate protections made. I finish on that, Minister. I would just say one last thing, which is that I think we need to recognise that this is not simply expenditure, that social protection is in fact fundamentally the investment that we make in our social fabric. And it is something that needs to be kind of recognised as not simply an output, but in fact an investment in the very idea that we're living together. And I think, and that social solidarity aspect. So I think we should make no apologies for the size of the budget. I think it should be increased. And I think that your obligations, Minister, because you do reflect that part of the social solidarity equation, you should feel strong to press in some of these areas for further resources. Thanks.